So we're really excited to partner with the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, which is one of our core facilities, to give their expertise in this area. This is, of course, leading up to World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is coming up on Friday, June 15th. And I'm just going to introduce our two speakers, Krista James and Valerie LeBlanc. Krista is the National Director of the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, as well as a staff lawyer. Her work is focused on the legal and policy issues that impact us as we age. Her practice includes legal research, policy analysis, and public legal education involving stakeholders from diverse sectors. She has written on topics such as abuse and neglect of older adults, mental capacity, age discrimination, and caregiving policy. So definitely the right person to be giving this talk today. And Valerie LeBlanc is a staff lawyer at the British Columbia Law Institute. Her academic success and commitment to social justice earned her the Anne Roberts Humanitarian Award in 2009. And she has worked in civil litigation firm in employment, human rights, and immigration law, as well as the provincial government, advising on labor and employment matters and workplace investigations. So welcome to both of our speakers, and I'll let you take it away.
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And just to let everyone know, this webinar is being recorded. So if you have colleagues who are interested in the subject but aren't able to attend today, AgeWell should be sending out a link to the recorded webinar in about a week or so. So this is World Elder Abuse Awareness Week. Oh, I don't seem to have control, Dorina, over the slides anymore. Can you hit that button?
Can you try it again?
Yep, I
got it.
There you go. Okay. All right. So I just want to start out by saying a few words about the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, which is where Valerie and I work. So the CCEL is a national non-profit organization focused on the legal issues that impact us as we age. Well, actually, we are a non-profit agency. We are part of a larger non-profit called the British Columbia Law Institute, which is BC's law reform agency. This year, we are celebrating 15 years of work on law and aging issues. Although we're a national agency, we work on projects that are local, provincial, or national in orientation. It just kind of depends on the needs and the funding. This slide mentions 4 facets of the work of the CCL, and I'm just going to, on the next few slides, talk about a few specific projects that fall into the elder abuse area that sort of touch on this different kind of scope of work. It's 4 parts of our scope of work. So we're currently updating our Practical Guide to Elder Abuse Neglect Law in Canada. It was published in 2011, and you can still find the guide in English and French on our website. We expect to have a new one available in a year. The guide provides details and laws that apply to elder abuse in each province and territory in Canada, as well as outlining some general legal and ethical principles and concepts to support you in your work. We're essentially providing a preview of the guide, the new guide, in this presentation today, and you'll be able to get more detail on all these subjects when the guide is published. I want to mention a couple ongoing projects. So inclusive investing is the second project. It's focused on supported decision-making, which is essentially an alternative to substitute decision-making or guardianship, which supports people with capacity challenges to be involved in decision-making about their lives. So we have a current project called Inclusive Investing, which looks at the use of supported decision-making in an investment context. How this is related to elder abuse is that a lot of the folks who are concerned about making supported decision-making available, particularly in an investment context, are practitioners who are concerned about elder abuse or undue influence. So what we're looking at in this project is, are there ways to support this practice in a way that provides some protections or monitoring to help prevent or permit a timely response to abuse and neglect of older adults and people with disabilities. The Older Women's Dialogue Project is a project we've been working on for quite a few years now. We've consulted with over 500 older women in multiple languages over the years, publishing 2 law reform reports, 1 promising practices tool, and a number of tools developed by older women themselves. And I mention it right now because just earlier this fall, we published a video called No Voice, which features older women who have experienced abuse talking about how the family law system in particular wasn't able to provide them with the kind of assistance they need. So that tool is available for you to support you in your own work. A few tools that we've developed in the past you might want to be aware of are the promising practices in housing older women fleeing abuse. This work was funded by the federal government and led by Atira Women's Resource Society. We wrote this tool, which includes 11 promising practices for really just finding a way to make your practice, your transition house, more accessible to older women who are fleeing abuse, recognizing that older women may experience different kinds of barriers to reaching out for assistance. A few years ago, we published a series of brochures in Chinese and English on helping to prevent elder abuse by helping powers of attorney to better understand, or attorneys under a power of attorney to better understand their rights and responsibilities as in this role as attorney, and also to help people who've granted a power of attorney to understand their options, including the one folks often don't know about, which is when you can take that document away if you don't trust the person any longer. So those brochures are available on our website. Also, quite a number of years ago, we published a series of tools called the Counterpoint Project. There's a discussion paper that looks at some of the criminal law provisions Valerie's going to be talking about today, as well as videos and fact sheets designed to support your practice. And all of the stuff that we produce at the CCEL, we try to make available on our website for free. The final slide in this presentation has our URL, so I encourage you to download the tools that are going to help you with your work. And if you have trouble finding any of them, you can probably easily find my email address through the URL as well and just send me a personal message. What we want to do in this presentation today is describe elder abuse and neglect. What are these concepts? Identify different laws across Canada that are relevant to elder abuse work. Share some ethical principles to guide your practice when you're concerned about an older person, and also to provide some basic resources to support you in your work. I need to always say, because we are lawyers, but we're not representing you in the context of providing a webinar, that this webinar is not legal advice. We can provide you with legal information on various topics, and I'm always happy to help connect people with the right person or right agency to provide that legal advice, but providing legal advice is not a role that we're allowed to play for community as a nonprofit. So I'm just going to pass the mic on to Valerie now. She is going to outline some of the provisions of the criminal law that apply to elder abuse and talk about elder abuse and neglect generally, and then I'm going to come back to the mic and talk about provincial and territorial legislation.
Thanks, Krista. So when we refer to this concept of elder abuse, what we really mean is as you can see, the deliberate mistreatment of older adults. So we can think about either actions or behavior, but even the lack of action or behavior towards an older adult. Some of the types of abuse that fall under the category of elder abuse, but are not limited to those, are what you see on the slide. So things like physical, mental, emotional, financial, or sexual harm or loss. In thinking about the types of actions that might constitute elder abuse, we use examples like things that may fall under intimidating acts or behavior, humiliation, physical or sexual assault, over-medication, withholding of medication, censorship of mail, invasion or denial of privacy of an older adult, or even denial of access to visitors. So those could be either family or friends. Some of the important things to consider when you're thinking about elder abuse and whether or not something falls under that is that abuse can occur either as a single occasion or it can be a repeated pattern of incidents. Incidents can even start out small, so may be difficult to detect, but can easily become more serious over time. And another important thing to note is that although we've given some examples of the types of categories of abuse, they can actually happen, there can be more than one type of abuse happening at the same time and possibly by the same person. When we think about neglect, what we're talking about is the failure to provide necessary care, assistance, or attention to an adult that causes or may reasonably likely to cause to the adult within a short period of time either serious physical, mental or emotional harm, or even substantial financial damage or loss, and can include in some jurisdictions what's known as self-neglect. And I'll be providing a definition sample for you a bit later on. When we talk about passive neglect, what we mean is that this can actually occur when a caregiver may unintentionally fail to provide the older adult with his or her physical, social, or emotional needs. So some examples that you can think about are if a caregiver lacks awareness of the full needs of the older adult, or possibly even lacks the skills in order to meet those needs. Another example could include a situation where a caregiver cannot psychologically manage or adjust to the older adult's changing abilities, because they can change over time or can fluctuate, especially in cases of capacity. And the caregiver may be exhausted or even experiencing loss in their own lives that could be impacting their ability to care for an older adult. When we think about active neglect, we're thinking about situations where a caregiver actually intentionally fails to meet an older adult's physical, social, or emotional needs. So examples could include things like denying an older person food, water, shelter, clothing, medication, or even medical attention, a failure to assist them with their basic necessities of life, or even, like we mentioned earlier, refusing visits from friends and family, which can also be accompanied by abusive forms of social isolation. When we think about who may be abusing and neglecting older adults, oftentimes it can fall into the categories that you see on the screen. And although older adults can be and are mistreated by strangers and con artists, elder abuse and neglect most often occurs in the context of a relationship, or more specifically, a relationship of trust. So in those situations, we're thinking about older adults who are being abused and neglected by people who have a relationship of trust with them, or even well known to them. So some of the individuals that may fall under that include family, friends, spouses, volunteer caregivers, legal guardians, or even care facility staff and professionals. So some examples of those include, but aren't limited to, doctors, nurses, possibly financial advisors, lawyers, etc. Abusers are sometimes dependent on the older adult for money, food, or shelter, but older adults can also be abused by younger family and friends who are either financially or emotionally dependent on them, and who may also be in the same living dwelling with them as well. Often there's an interdependent relationship between the abuser and the older person who's being abused or neglected. So even in cases where the older person may be frail, they may in fact be caring for the person who could be harming them. So an example of this could be an older adult who is living and caring for an older adult child. The reality that older people are often harmed by people for whom they care deeply can make it really challenging to identify the most helpful way of providing them with support. Also, in circumstances where visitors are being refused or prevented from seeing an older adult, that type of social isolation can actually make an adult more vulnerable to abuse, or make it harder for them to access assistance. So what the next few slides are going to do is to give you just a few examples of some of the legal definitions of abuse across the country. I'm not actually going to read the definitions out that are on the screen, but rather it's important to consider that depending on which jurisdiction you're in, the definition of abuse under the relevant statutes may differ, and there are a variety of definitions. So what we actually encourage you to do is take some time to actually visit the relevant statutes in your jurisdiction to see how abuse and neglect may be defined there. What we have here is an example from BC's Adult Guardianship Act. And just some of the things to note about this particular slide and the ones that will follow is that as I said, definitions of abuse are fairly consistent across the country. They will commonly include things like, or the types of abuse that we've mentioned, such as emotional, financial, physical, or sexual abuse. And in some jurisdictions, for example, like in Ontario, different types of abuse will actually be further defined in the legislation. Some notable distinctions to consider, though, is that In some jurisdictions, for example, Quebec, they may use different terms to mean abuse. So in Quebec, they actually use the term exploitation, not abuse specifically. And there are also only some jurisdictions that include damage to property or financial abuse. Here's another example out of Newfoundland. And just one of the points I'd like to highlight from this definition is that you'll see abuse means the deliberate mistreatment of an adult who lacks the capacity to protect himself or herself that causes or is reasonably likely within a short period of time to cause them, and then the following types of abuse. So the important thing to consider there is that Newfoundland has actually built in a notion of vulnerability into their definition. Here is a sample definition of abuse out of Ontario. Again, I won't read it out, but it goes to what we said earlier, that some jurisdictions will include definitions on specific types. This one falls under the regulation under the Long-Term Care Homes Act. And they also define verbal abuse to include things like communications that are belittling or degrading in nature that diminish a sense of well-being, dignity, or self-worth. Okay, so in terms of the definition of neglect, this one is a sample out of Prince Edward Island. And as we said earlier, neglect generally denotes harm to the person, or in this particular case can include their belongings or property, or as they've said, the estate. Another example here out of BC. One of the things to note is that BC actually includes self-neglect, which was briefly mentioned earlier, and I'll just give you the definition of that because I think it's worth noting. Self-neglect means any failure of an adult to take care of himself or herself that causes or is reasonably likely to cause, within a short period of time, serious physical or mental harm or substantial damage or loss in respect of the adult's financial affairs, and includes living in grossly unsanitary conditions, suffering from an untreated illness, disease, or injury, suffering from malnutrition to such an extent that without intervention, the adult's physical or mental health is likely to be severely impaired, creating a hazardous situation that will likely cause serious physical harm to the adult or others, or cause substantial damage to or loss of property, and also suffering from an illness, disease, or injury that results in the adult dealing with his or her financial affairs in a manner that is likely to cause substantial damage or loss in respect of those financial affairs. So again, a fairly robust definition. Oh, I seem to have lost control.
Yeah, Dorina, we've lost control.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Oh.
Oh, that's your next slide.
Okay, so this is my next slide here. So the next set of slides that I'm going to try to briefly go over are the ones that consider the federal laws that may apply to situations of abuse and neglect of older adults. They'll depend on the circumstances and facts of the specific case, but are worth considering. So in asking the question, is elder abuse and neglect a crime? While there is no specific crime of elder abuse in the criminal code, some acts of elder abuse or neglect will amount to a crime under Canadian law. Most crimes, except crimes involving children and minors, apply regardless of age. And to provide some more context, we identify some of those relevant crimes on the following slides. In situations where the police are contacted, they will sometimes respond to an elder abuse call, and some communities have elder abuse units that include a police officer and a social worker that individuals can connect with. That said, often older people really don't want the police involved or do not wish to see someone they love prosecuted or put in jail. If they would like to place a call to the police, then that may be something that you may be able to assist with. However, it would rarely be appropriate to call the police without the older adult's permission. As we discuss later on and as part of practice, you may also want to sort out how to conduct a risk assessment in order to help identify the best response to a particular circumstance of abuse. I seem to have lost control again.
Maybe I'll just advance the slides for you,
Okay, thank you.
because it doesn't seem to be giving you the control back. It's saying,
Not a problem.
yeah, so I'll just say next slide and I'll be happy to do it.
So these are some of the types of criminal code provisions that may apply to situations of physical elder abuse. However, there are many other crimes that could fit, again, depending on the facts. So these are just a small sampling. Next slide. In terms of situations of neglect, again, they're pretty self-explanatory here, but we're thinking about situations where someone fails to provide the necessities of life or commits other acts that may fall under what would be considered criminal negligence. Next slide. In thinking about sexual abuse, an important thing to consider with a lot of these provisions is that, and as we said earlier, sometimes there's situations of abuse where more than one type of abuse is occurring and could be by the same person. So there's often an overlap between what may be physical or sexual abuse and possibly emotional or psychological abuse. Next slide. And here are just some instances where even emotional or psychological abuse alone could amount to a crime. Next slide. These are some of the examples of criminal code provisions that may relate to situations of financial abuse. So thinking about loss or damage to financial affairs or resources that the older adult may be relying on. Some of the ones that aren't listed here but could be included under this category are extortion under Section 346, forgery under 366 and 368, or situations of fraud. And there's several sections there that I won't read them all out, but those are some of the other ones to consider. Next slide. And this table, in doing the research for the practical guide update, this information was adapted from a resource in BC on elder abuse and neglect, and it's just intended to give you an idea of how to consider some of the types of behaviors or actions that could be considered non-criminal forms of abuse and what may fall under the criminal categories. Next slide. So in the criminal code, under the section 718.2, if a person has victimized an older adult, a judge is required to take the age of the victim into account when increasing or decreasing the length of a sentence. And in 2012, it's worth noting that the Protecting Canada's Seniors Act actually amended the criminal code to include a new provision which says that the judge also needs to consider the impact of the crime on the older adult, specifically in relation to their health, financial situation, and age. So if you think about a situation where a person who has been convicted of a crime has perhaps intentionally targeted an older adult because they were perceived to be vulnerable or weak, or has victimized a community of older adults, then their sentencing may be harsher. Next slide. Thank you. So here I just give you the direct citation to the Protecting Canada Seniors Act and some of the language from the provision that was included. As we said on the previous slide, there may be situations where there are aggravating or mitigating circumstances that need to be considered. So what we take from the new sentencing provisions is that the age of the older person being harmed can have a significant impact on the sentence itself. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over again to Krista to talk to you about the different elder abuse laws across the country.
Hi, Dorita. Next slide, please. So a thing to bear in mind is that although the criminal law is federal, it applies everywhere in Canada, each province and territory has taken a fairly unique approach to developing both laws and public agencies to address elder abuse. And in no instances are the laws designed specifically to address elder abuse, but more abuse of vulnerable adults, abuse of adults in different kinds of situations, living in different contexts. And public agencies, again, are generally designed to support people who need assistance rather than elder abuse per se, although there are a couple jurisdictions, such as Quebec, who have an elder abuse hotline. From a practical perspective, this means that, especially if your work is national, you need to always be mindful of where is the abuse occurring, what province or territory is abuse happening in. And if your work practice is national, there may be a range of different kinds of laws you need to be aware of. Next slide, please. So when thinking about elder abuse across the country, there We're going to provide some specific examples in this presentation to illustrate the range of approaches that you see. This slide here identifies different types of laws that are relevant to elder abuse, and this is our way of breaking down the laws that apply to elder abuse into different categories. But there are different ways to think of the differences and similarities. As Valerie showed in the first set of slides, there are a lot of similarities between the definitions of abuse that occur in different legislation, but the legislation will be sandwiched in different kinds of legislation. So there's adult protection legislation in some jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions have domestic violence legislation. Some have laws that apply just to care facilities which deal with abuse. In some jurisdictions, the public guardian trustee may have some powers. And then you see a few other approaches that are totally unique that you'll find in only one province or territory. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now is just give you kind of a nutshell of which jurisdictions take which different approaches. So if you're, say, working in Prince Edward Island, you might want to know which kinds of legislation can be found in your jurisdiction. So there are a number of jurisdictions that have taken an approach of developing adult protection laws that apply to abuse and neglect of older adults, and they may also include some provisions around guardianship. Generally, these kinds of legislation apply to respond to situations where there's abuse of vulnerable adults, not abuse and neglect of older adults per se. And this kind of legislation was generally designed to deal with situations where people have disabilities, may be older, there may be different kinds of parts of their experience that result in a vulnerability to abuse. And so the laws were designed to provide extra provisions for protection to people who are more vulnerable than others. Under the legislation, it's usually permissive. A person may report abuse to an agency designated in the law with powers to respond to allegations of abuse or neglect, or maybe also self-neglect of a vulnerable older person. In most jurisdictions, it's permissive. It's not mandatory to report abuse. The exception is Nova Scotia, where it is mandatory to report abuse, and there's technically a fine attached to failure to report, although I really haven't heard stories about enforcement of those provisions. The jurisdictions in Canada that have taken an adult protection approach to dealing with elder abuse are British Columbia, Nova Scotia, PEI, the Yukon, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Newfoundland has the most recently created legislation. Up until quite recently, it only had legislation that dealt with neglect specifically. Can you advance the slides, please? So some jurisdictions have developed some jurisdictions have developed slides that deal with legislation that deals with violence in relationships. So they're generally titled domestic violence legislation. Although they're designed to address specifically spousal violence, they can apply to elder abuse. And what's important to note about them is what they generally do is they set out specific court powers to respond to abuse. And you'll be familiar with some of these provisions. They include sort of protection orders or restraining orders. They also include warrants for arrest. And these statutes will set out the different kinds of things that could be in a protection order, which can range from a requirement to counseling, an inability to have firearms, a requirement to stay away. So it kind of sets out a framework for judge powers. Often getting these provisions can perhaps a bit legally complicated. So it's useful to have some legal assistance. And in a number of jurisdictions, you can get legal aid to provide you with assistance if you are at risk of abuse. So one way you can support an older adult is in helping them to apply for legal aid. Now, a number of jurisdictions have these provisions, but they don't, some provisions can also be in general family law legislation. So for example, domestic violence legislation, these short statutes exist in Alberta, Manitoba, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Saskatchewan, and all three territories. But some other jurisdictions like BC, for example, have embedded some of these powers right into broader family law statutes. So just the fact of not having family violence legislation doesn't mean these powers do not exist in your jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Another kind of legislation that exists in different jurisdictions in Canada that can apply to elder abuse is legislation that is intended to deal with care facility contexts. So there are a number of jurisdictions that have acts specifically called Protection for Persons in Care Act. And they create a requirement for care facilities to respond to abuse occurring in the facility. Jurisdictions that have that kind of legislation are Alberta, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. And these statutes make it mandatory to respond, generally, whether you're a visitor or you work in the care facility. And they're grounded in an understanding that people living in care facilities may be particularly vulnerable to abuse and not able to protect themselves due to disability or frailty. Which is, again, if you think about adult protection legislation, the same principles kind of embedded in it. Adult protection legislation doesn't apply to all kinds of elder abuse, just elder abuse occurring when the adult is vulnerable and not able to protect themselves. Protection for persons in care legislation moves forward from the assumption that everybody living in a care facility is vulnerable, and so legislation applies to all adults who are resident. You will find that in some jurisdictions they haven't created actual protection for persons in care statutes, but the legislation regulating care homes includes a mandatory response to abuse. And that would include Saskatchewan, BC, and Ontario at minimum, I'm aware of. Next slide, please. Now, another kind of legislation that arguably applies to elder abuse and neglect is legislation around the powers of public guardians and trustees. In some jurisdictions, there is well, not all jurisdictions have a public guardian trustee. Some have just a public guardian, some have just a public trustee, some have, a combined role, and some have granted their public guardian trustee some legal authority to intervene in instances of financial abuse or abuse by a power of attorney, trustee, or guardian. And here's an example where you really do want to read the fine print of legislation, because each jurisdiction is quite unique in terms of how and if they have granted authority to a PGT to respond. The kind of powers that you might find in this sort of legislation is a power to freeze assets temporarily, so that an emergent response can occur in community without a loss of assets. But powers do vary significantly across the province. Next slide, please. I think it's also worthwhile to mention that there are a few statutes across the country that take totally different approaches and that complement existing legislation. So Quebec has its human rights statute refers to exploitation of adults. Of older adults. So it doesn't talk about abuse and neglect, it talks about exploitation, but as a result of that, their human rights tribunal can essentially respond to allegations of abuse and neglect, and has sort of diverse powers of response that would be more parallel to the powers that a human rights tribunal might have. In Manitoba is a unique jurisdiction that has created legislation specifically dealing with vulnerable persons living with a mental disability, and that legislation provides some requirement to respond to abuse of adults. And again, this legislation is not designed to deal with older adults, but a number of older people might fall under the definition within the statute of having a mental disability. Although specifically, my sense is the legislation was developed specifically to deal with the situation of adults with developmental disabilities and the advocacy of families within that jurisdiction lobbying to get some unique legislation developed to deal with the vulnerability of the people in their families. Next slide. So responding to abuse and neglect. On a practical level, when you're in a situation where you see an adult and you're just concerned about their well-being, I encourage you to start from a place of urgency, just to think of yourself in a hospital doing triage, but you're not looking at, the blood on the table, but you're looking at a different kind of urgency. So figuring out what the urgency is might help you to identify what might be the right next step. So think about, is the adult in danger of immediate harm? Is there a risk that property is going to be stolen or spent, in a very short period of time? Does the adult appear to lack the mental capacity, so the ability to make their own decisions, keep themselves safe, figure out what to do? Those kind of factors might indicate greater risk or vulnerability and might indicate there's a need to respond more quickly. Next slide, please. You can always consider, do you want to call 911 to get emergency assistance for the older person? But it's often not the right response. But these services are available in all communities, most communities across Canada, for all people regardless of age. it's always important to be aware of what the person wants. You know, if a person has mental capacity, they have the right to decide what happens to themselves. And just like a woman who's in an abusive relationship, we don't take her power away and call the police for her if she doesn't want the police called, if she has the ability to make that decision for herself. So you always want to be mindful of not taking people's power away and making decisions for them. Paternalism is not generally appropriate in responding to elder abuse. If you do call the police, you'll be asked to provide basic information, right? Like they'll ask about what your concerns are, why you feel that what has happened. Sometimes police will be concerned that it's not their jurisdiction to respond to a situation because it's a family matter. And then I would encourage you to think back to the slides that Valerie went through that talked about different crimes under the criminal code that could apply in a context of elder abuse. So although emotional abuse is not a crime, intimidation is a crime. So that is, to my mind, why it's useful to go through some of these criminal statutes, although we don't expect you to memorize the criminal laws, just to think, well, criminal laws do apply to a victim regardless of age. If you call the police, they'll ask for your name, your phone number. You can't really do it anonymously. You will become a witness. And the police response will generally include attending the location, possibly dispatching an elder abuse unit if they have one in that community, and they will look at options. And when I've spoken to police officers who respond to elder abuse calls, they've said to me that a good chunk of the work they do is social work. It's really supporting families and trying to find the response that's the right one, depending on what are the particular circumstances. And sometimes they will take an abuser away, detain them, and put in a peace bond or a protection order, but that's not always the right response. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned before, responding to abuse and neglect, it's not really mandatory in most jurisdictions or most contexts, but it's useful to be aware that if you work in a care facility, you could have a legal duty to respond to abuse, and it's best to talk to your supervisor about what to do. The exception is in Nova Scotia, technically there is a legal obligation of everyone to report abuse. And the legislation generally that requires you to report abuse, such as in Nova Scotia, has complementary provisions that provide you with some anonymity. So you can make it, it's harder to make an anonymous call to the police because they often want witnesses to a crime if you're reporting a crime. But if you're reporting abuse under adult guardianship legislation or in Canada, you have more protection in terms of the ability to make an anonymous report. Next slide, please. So when you're responding to abuse, I encourage you to consider not just the law. You need to figure out what are the rules that apply to your place of employment. Your employer, hopefully, if you work with vulnerable adults, often as part of your work, has created policy that applies to elder abuse. The institution might have policies. The other thing is that if you are a healthcare professional, a social worker, a lawyer, another regulated professional, you might have some professional obligations to respond to abuse that are linked to your code of ethics. You will also have professional obligations likely around protecting confidentiality. So your response needs to balance those different, sometimes competing professional obligations. But to my knowledge, very few professionals have a legal obligation to respond to abuse in professional codes of ethics. So please don't assume that that's the case in your situation. Your regulatory body is an excellent resource in understanding your professional obligations, and you may have practice guidelines that have been developed to support you in your work. So if you look at the website for your regulatory body, you'll probably find a lot of helpful information in this regard. And as an example, we were retained a number of years ago by the occupational therapists, the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists, to develop some tools to help their members understand elder abuse. A lot of the material is actually relevant to anybody responding to abuse in Canada, so you can take a look at their website if you want some more information about professional obligations. Next slide, please. So the next two slides, I'm not going to go into them in detail. I think you can access these slides through AgeWell. They list agencies in each jurisdiction that would be the go-to agency to call if you have concerns about abuse and neglect. So we've listed a number of agencies on these two slides. Oh, can you advance the next slide? See some other jurisdictions. So as you see in Quebec, it's the Human Rights Commission and not an adult protection unit. Very different agencies in different jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is talk about some guiding principles for practice, because I think often the law isn't the final answer for what to do. I don't know why this slide says British Columbia at the top, but please ignore where it says British Columbia at the top of the PowerPoint. These are ethical principles that I think apply across the country. So I always start with talk to the older adult. Ask questions and find out what his or her experience is and what they want to happen and what resources might be considered helpful from their perspective. Please avoid making assumptions. The best response is almost always the response the older person identifies as helpful. And you get a lot of information by talking to people, and you may find out things about the situation that you weren't aware of. And it takes time, right? Like it may be more than one conversation over a period of time, not just one quick discussion. Next slide, please. So respect personal values, priorities, goals, lifestyle choices of an older adult. And this follows from the other slide really, and identify networks that make sense for them. So you want to ask questions that help you figure out what they want. The same responses are not going to work for everyone. And it's important to appreciate that people have different comfort levels. Some people are willing to live with more risk in their home. And some people are not. So you need to figure out kind of what meets their needs. Next slide, please. Fundamentally, it's really important to recognize the right to make decisions. And we have laws across country that kind of enshrine this right. There's a presumption in so many different, I would say in a number of different laws in each jurisdiction, that we start with capacity. We assume people are mentally capable of making their own decisions unless otherwise has been established. So start from that in your place and in your work with older adults. If you see something that indicates the person may not have capacity, you might need to get additional resources to support them. But in general, a mentally capable adult is able to understand information and appreciate the consequences of a decision. If you're not able to make a capacity assessment, an informal capacity assessment of what they know, you might need to pull someone else in your team who understands capacity a little more. But what I always say when I teach about capacity is that although some practitioners have the role of, such as geriatric psychiatrists, they may have a role of making formal capacity assessments to inform court decisions. Most of us make capacity assessments in our work. For example, as a lawyer, I could never to create a document unless I felt they understood the document and what its impact was. So, but if a person doesn't have capacity, there may be a heightened obligation on the state and heightened legal provisions to assist that older adult if they are experiencing abuse and neglect. But the law does not make mentally capable people receive assistance they do not wish to receive. Next slide, please. So seek consent or permission. In most situations, you should get consent from an older adult before taking action. You should ask for consent first unless it is an emergency. Abuse as an experience takes people's power away. This applies regardless of age. So you want to be conscious that your response to abuse serves to empower the older person, not further remove their personal power. Making them feel weak is probably not going to help them get strong. Next slide, please. Respect confidentiality and privacy rights. This is important not just because it's a professional obligation for many of us and because it's a law, but because it impacts on your ability to help a person. If an older person feels that you're betraying their privacy, they are likely not going to rely on you for assistance. And it can be a process. It can take time to get help when you're experiencing abuse. This is often not a situation solved by one conversation and one phone call. But in general, it's against the law to disclose a person's personal or health information without first getting consent from that person. Okay, next slide, please. So you want to avoid ageism. So you want to prevent ageist assumptions or discriminatory thinking based on age from affecting your judgment. So you want to try to catch yourselves. Am I thinking this person needs help because they're older, and so I don't think that they are making good decisions because they're older and they don't know what's right for them? We don't lose our rights just because we get older. Most laws are age neutral. And respect for people's rights is it's kind of what makes us feel like important and full citizens in community. As soon as people feel like we're trying to take their power away or not respecting their rights, we lose their trust. Next slide, please. It's important to respect the value of independence and autonomy. So where it's consistent with the older adult's wishes, you want to assist the adult to identify the least intrusive way to access assistance or support. The idea is to honor and safeguard the adult's independence as much as possible, while at the same time helping the person to get the right assistance. Next slide, please. I encourage you to develop a trauma-informed practice. So learning how to support people who have experienced trauma will enhance your practice no matter what kind of work you do. People respond to situations in ways that are sometimes unexpected when they've lived with trauma for a short or long period of time. What their response could seem at first glance to indicate a lack of mental capacity to you, but on reflection, if you understand their experience through a lens of trauma, you might realize that their response is just a well-honed survival skill that they've lived with for a long time. There are a number of agencies in community that provide trauma-informed practice training. Next slide, please. I encourage you to consider Indigenous experiences if you're dealing with an older person who's experienced abuse who is an Indigenous person. Indigenous people have experienced so much abuse through health and other systems, so much racism through child welfare system, colonization, that they often have a pretty understandable distrust of agencies that you might think are helpful. Also, the experience of removal from family through residential schools and foster homes will mean that institutional responses to abuse may be experienced by them differently. They may have tremendous fear about loss of freedom and connection to your community that it's hard to understand if you haven't really been in their shoes. So again, we've learned a lot from the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I encourage you also to make sure that folks in your office have training around working specifically with Indigenous older adults if that's part of your work. Next slide, please. So finally, I would encourage you to apply a holistic lens to all of your work with older adults. You know, the same response is not going to work for every person. So ask yourself, is the older person an immigrant, a survivor of spousal violence before elder abuse, an Indigenous person, a transgendered person? Do they have a disability? Are there substance use issues? Do they worry about safety and well-being of someone else in their family? Are they in a kind of dependency relationship where they're providing care to someone? What relationships matter the most to them? How can you provide support in a way that preserves meaningful and valuable relationships and connection to community? Are there issues of poverty that impact access to services? All these kind of factors are going to impact what kind of a response to abuse might be appropriate. So try to see the person as a whole person with a really complex life experience. So I'm just going to, oh, next slide, please, Dorina. And I'm going to pass the mic on to Valerie just to bring us home.
Okay, so what you have in front of you is part of what we want as the takeaway is for you to be able to have some resources that you can turn to in your region, but also they may include federal resources as well if you're looking for specific information. So this slide covers some examples of where you can go to get information and take a look at specific legislation in your region. So the Criminal Code of Canada can be accessed on the Federal Justice website. There's also the Legislative Assembly websites that are based in each province and territory that have very useful information on existing changes to the law, but also changes that may be coming. CanLII is a free online legal resource that will provide you access to legislation, cases, but also some useful commentary on cases and some helpful additional like secondary type of resources that will give you background information. There's also the provincial, territorial, and federal court websites. So they may be able to give you more specifics on cases, but also where there may be resources available for assistance there. And then another good resource that I encourage people to think about is law libraries. So whether they're in a courthouse or at a law school in the province or territory, the law librarians can often be a very useful resource if you're looking to get some background information on elder abuse and neglect, and they can often develop tools to help walk you through how to access that information. Next slide. So another great resource is the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, or CNPEA for short. They have a number of publications and tools on their website. So I certainly encourage you to go there and have a look. But one of the ones that we wanted to draw your attention to is their Get Help page, because they actually provide province and territory specific information of what's available in your region. So they have some great resources you can download. Examples of what you might find there are seniors abuse resources, human rights information, information on housing, women's services, crime victim assistance services, health authority or agency information, and some include contact information and scope for legal aid assistance. Next slide. So as an overview of what we've discussed today, we'd like to have you take away from this presentation that when you're responding to elder abuse and neglect, it's important to consider where the abuse is occurring. So for example, is it happening in a care home, or is it taking place in an independent dwelling? And what region is it taking place in? What are some of the things you need to consider depending on the region that you're in to respond to elder abuse and neglect there? Also thinking about, does the older person have the capacity to take action on their own? This really gets at the issue of vulnerability, and we saw some of that in the earlier discussion today. Many laws that address abuse of adults are designed to address adults who lack mental capacity or have a disability or other impairment that impacts on their ability to protect themselves or get help. Also think about what is the degree of urgency. So we heard from Krista how important it is to think about what needs to be done right away versus what could be, where more time could be spent to think about different ways of responding. So is there a risk of immediate harm to the older person or their belongings or their financial affairs? Or is there an opportunity to spend a bit more time with them to think about what may be a different course of action? Also, what matters most to the older person? So that was another theme that we really wanted to emphasize during the presentation, is that it's important to think about what the older adult wants and what relationships matter to him or her. Is she concerned about anyone else? Is there more than one individual that needs to be thought about here? And does she want to go anywhere? That's also important to think about, especially if it's a situation where they're living with the individual who may be abusing or neglecting them. And does she want the abuser to be charged with a crime? As Krista said, it won't always be the appropriate response. So it's important to take these things into consideration. Next slide. So again, these points here are just meant to get you thinking about the issue of vulnerability, and that oftentimes it's situations where they may not have the ability to help themselves that requires having another individual to come in and provide some form of support that would be appropriate in that situation, and also making sure that their views and their wishes are taken into consideration when helping them decide which way they want to go. Next slide. And again, as we said earlier, a lot of our resources and information are published on the Canadian Centre for Elder Law website. So we encourage all of you to access that information and familiarize yourselves with what's available in your region. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both for such an informative presentation. There's a bit of feedback.
Yeah, we're happy to answer questions or your feedback. Sure.
Yeah. So if anyone has questions, please type them into the chat box, and we will have our presenters answer them. I guess just to start off, I've got a quick question for you, just in terms of language. You mentioned one of the resources you had it translated into Chinese. Just wondering, what happens when language becomes, a factor in some of these cases where it's an elderly individual whose first language may not be English, and how to navigate that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think one of the most important things is to try to access professional interpretation. We've often hear from people who having to rely on different family members to act as interpreter, and that's generally not appropriate, especially if there's an abusive family dynamic. We don't know what the relationship is between that older adult and the person who's doing the interpretation. If you don't speak both languages, you don't know how accurate the interpretation is. There are some services where you can get assistance with simultaneous translation. Like, for example, I know in British Columbia, if you call the CCEL line, they have simultaneous translation available. So you can get assistance in any language by calling that 1-800 number in BC. So sometimes there are services that can help with the language piece, but you don't want to assume that someone in the house can necessarily provide accurate translation. Police will often have interpretation available to them, services available as part of their team as well. You can sometimes partner with helpful agencies, you know, like you may have to make an appointment in advance, but there are agencies that can assist with the interpretation.
That's great. So I'm not seeing any questions here, but I'll give folks maybe one more minute and to write into the chat box. And while they do that, I just want to let folks know about our next webinar, which is on predicting and preventing falls using technology. It's on Thursday, July 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern with Dr. Steve Rabinovich, who is a professor at Simon Fraser University. We will send that link out if you're interested, and you can always visit our website to register. So I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to say thank you to both of our speakers today for an informative presentation. I think it really got at a comprehensive look at the law, not only, you know, at the federal, but kind of across Canada and how things look slightly differently across our provinces and territories. We have one comment from Barb. She says, thank you for this informative and interesting webinar. I look forward to learning more about this topic by reviewing the resources referenced today. So perfect. Thank you both.
Thanks, Rita.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.